naive sort of cat's paw for the British royal family, the Bank of England, and the other sinister conspirators who are really plotting to destroy Russia or whatever. And so,
for them, we are the Bond villains.
Yeah, right. And so their
baddies,
images,
right?
Their images. I mean, they show again and again images of nuclear weapons destroying Britain. I mean, there's so much so that they had a protest from the Irish Foreign Ministry because those missiles also showed them blowing up Ireland.
Well, they had that classic British, the classic Bond villain thing where they were going to detonate a nuclear missile in the Atlantic, and a tsunami would wash over both Britain and Ireland.
You know what's interesting though, guys, is that all it would take was for someone like Vladimir Putin to use a nuclear weapon in an out of the way place in the middle of nowhere, blow up some factory and the taboo would be broken. And I mean, I believe that when we talk about needing a reminder, and we were talking about how long it's been since these weapons were used, there's this sense that, okay, well, no one would really use one. And I think something like that would I don't mean to put ideas into someone's head, but certainly the ideas are already there. Something like that would be a game changer because it would literally be the way of saying, you think this could never happen. We're going to show you that we're serious. It's funny because after the Soviet Union fell, because you'd mentioned Able Archer, but I mean, the last time we almost had a disaster was during the Boris Yeltsin era, where there was a mistake, right? Where somebody had misread radar or something. And you turn around and you go, okay, when I was, I don't know, a television news guy in my 20s, that's how we thought a nuclear war might happen, right? No one would obviously go and declare the Third World War. But these things, I mean, there's a great book called The Dead Hand, which is about the Soviet system that was in place in case their entire command and control structure were wiped out. It could still launch a retaliatory strike. And I think during the Yeltsin era, we thought, okay, the only way this is going to happen now is because of a mistake. And now we're back where we were 40 years ago, where you can actually envision someone like Putin saying, okay, I'm going to use a nuclear weapon in the middle of nowhere just to show everybody that they're out there, we can use them, and you're not safe from them.
But well, I mean, to be positive, just to be cheery for a bit.
that is not what we do
here. A bit of a downer. I mean, he's hinted at that, and this is clearly what he's brilliant at, is making people's flesh creep and menaces. It's kind of mafia type intimidation of shop owners or whatever. I mean, he's very.
Do you mean
very
the British as shop owners? Is that what the nation of
well,
shopkeepers? Is that what we're talking about?
I mean, he's kind of it would be awful if you did something and I had to do something terrible in response without actually saying what the terrible thing is.
Nice country you have here. Be ashamed if something happened to it. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. But actually, there have been a kind of number of dogs that haven't barked in the night. So obviously, the use of a tactical nuclear missile, battlefield nuclear missile, is one of them. But also, and I don't know whether this is because our cybersecurity is so good or because actually Russian cyber attacks aren't as good as we'd thought they were, but there haven't been kind of devastating attacks on Western cyber infrastructure. And you'd thought that perhaps there might be, certainly at kind of defense institutions or whatever. And that is a kind of the raft of hope that I cling to.
Yeah. There's a reassuring element of shambles about the. But I guess you could say though, Dan, that's actually not reassuring because it's out of incompetence and chaos that mistakes are made and accidents happen.
Yes.
So I suppose you can see that two ways. Will a nuclear war start because a Dr. Evil thinks it's in their interests, or will it start because people are in a complete mess? They're frightened, everything's falling apart around their ears. I mean, that's probably the more likely scenario, isn't it? Than a villain starting, Bond villain starting a world war.
I think the implication of the fact that these kind of horror options haven't been taken up, I suspect must be because there are channels of communication that remain open between the Kremlin and the White House, between the Pentagon and the Russian military establishment, and it must have been intimated on both sides that there are red lines beyond which you shouldn't go.
But you guys know
probably
better than
with
anyone.
sufficient.
You know that sometimes dynamics get ahead of decision making. I mean, that's the whole First World War idea. That's the Cuban Missile Crisis, and which brings me back, not to change subjects radically, but we called the series that we did on the First World War "Blueprint for Armageddon" because it was as Gwen Dyer, the military historian, had said, the entrance into the idea of total war that makes the Second World War possible and the kinds of conversations we're having now possible. Can I shift and ask you guys another question similar to the one we did about the Romans and the Normans in 1066? But I want to ask you your views on First World War Germany versus Second World War Germany. And I had made the statement once that I thought, relative to the other powers involved, that the First World War German state was the stronger or more dangerous foe than the Second World War one. Now, in the United States, there's a fascination with the Second World War, the Nazi state. The technology is enticing and entrancing and all those kinds of things. But it was my position that the First World War was the more stable society, the more deep society with the stronger foundation. Do you folks have any views on that? Maybe you differ from each other. I don't know.
I totally agree with you, Dan. So I'm a complete heretic on this because, as I think we discussed when you came on our podcast, I think Britain should have fought on the other side in the First World War.
Did you really?
Which is not a view you'll often
No,
hear.
no.
I'm a great fan of, I like a Central European.
Those
coffee
damn
house.
Belgians were asking for invasion.
Right. This was our chance, to deal with the French once and for all, and we blew it. Anyway, listen, I think I would say I agree with you. Wilhelmine Germany was in many ways, an infinitely, as you say, deeper, more stable, more secure society than Nazi Germany. So, if you think, Germany entering the 1910s, highly educated, very high level of political participation, very strong labor unions, for example. It's not obviously much less democratic than Britain or France, let's say, and I think it's it's in many ways remarkable, given the forces arrayed against it by the end of 1914, that Germany fights on as long and almost forces a draw. Could force a draw conceivably in 1917 or 1918. Nazi Germany, on the other hand, it's obviously led by somebody who is descending as the war continues, deeper and deeper into paranoia. It's unstable. It doesn't have clear war aims. Everything is being improvised, as they go along. It also has this distraction of its kind of anti-Semitic mission, which they feel more and more motivated to accomplish as the war goes on, and Hitler's sort of obsessive anti-Bolshevism as well, which obviously leads him to invade the Soviet Union. It's a much more it's a more, what's the word? It's more dysfunctional, more hysterical kind of society. So I would say, the 1910s Germany is a much more formidable proposition. It's got, the Austro-Hungary is not the greatest ally in the world, but it's also got the Ottoman Empire, which Britain makes a terrible mess of fighting at first at Gallipoli. So and I think that the First World War could easily have ended in a draw, whereas there's a good argument, I would say, that Hitler was always going to lose the Second World War once he doesn't knock Britain out in 1940, and especially once he invades the Soviet Union and then declares war on the United States. A draw is unthinkable from that point onwards, I would say.
I completely agree that Wilhelmine Germany, economically, culturally, militarily, is formidably strong. It's probably, with the United States, a vision of the future. If you're standing there in 1910, Britain already seems antiquated in comparison to both those countries, and Wilhelmine Germany with its kind of universities. We've said at the beginning that technology and the ability to innovate is fundamental to military prowess and power. And in that sense, Germany is absolutely cutting edge. However, obviously, the one thing to say about Nazi Germany is that ideas kill as well as tanks. And the ideas that the Nazis embody are lethally dangerous. way off the scale compared to any of the combatant powers in the First World War, and that has to be factored into, I think any comparison of the two Germanys. That 6 million people were destroyed for ideological reasons by Nazi Germany, and that simply wouldn't have happened even had the Kaiser won the First World War. Nothing comparable to that would have happened. I don't think that that being defeated by the Kaiser would have been a pleasant experience, but it was it was nothing comparable to being occupied by the Nazis.
Let me say that I think that plays a role into why the First World War state was stronger than the Second World War state. You go to the cemeteries from the First World War, the German cemeteries, and you will come across the graves of Jewish German patriots who fought for that regime. And you look at for example, nuclear scientists who defected from the Nazi German state and then helped the Allies. These are all people who conceivably, in a less ideological, less anti-Semitic sort of society, would have perhaps been fighting on the other side. It doesn't that, by its very nature, when you're taking people who are members of your population, and I mean, even at the end of the war, when the resources were so strained, they're still sending, the train cars to the death camps, right?
Absolutely, and I agree with Dominic that basically, the moment that Hitler fails to knock Britain out of the war, he's going to lose the war, I think. But suppose he had knocked Britain out of the war, suppose he'd occupied Britain, suppose he had established a kind of empire, a Reich over continental Europe and Britain. The impact of that would have been immeasurably more devastating than the Allies in the First World War being knocked out.
Do you even see that as possible? See, when I look at it, and maybe I just lack imagination, I can't imagine that happening. I mean, Churchill talked about, everybody, you could always take one with you and all that, but was a cross-channel invasion, and you guys know, I mean, a D-Day in reverse seems to have been...
Well, again, I don't think that there was ever any prospect of an invasion, but I do think there was a prospect of Britain suing for terms.
Yeah, I agree. That's
which is why I think, what is it? Is it 10 Days in May, 9 Days in May? I can never remember. The John Lukács book.
Yeah,
brilliant analysis as the kind of the pivot of the 20th century. This period while Dunkirk is happening and France is in the process of surrendering, and there's a possibility that Churchill will be toppled and that the British government will open peace feelers to Italy and therefore by extension to Germany. And the very process of opening up peace feelers would have crippled Britain's ability to maintain morale. And that perhaps there you would, Britain might not have been occupied, but it would have been a kind of Vichyist regime. And would the United States have become engaged then if it was a kind of continental Europe with this lethally anti-Semitic, racist regime that essentially was kind of trampling pretty much every ideal that the modern contemporary West holds sacred? I think that would have been possible.
I think the scenarios are interesting because let's imagine that the Kaiser's Germany either wins. I mean, it wins the First World War, I think, by Britain not becoming engaged in the war. So let's imagine the Kaiser's Germany wins the First World War. The Kaiser's Germany is then hegemonic in continental Europe in going into the 1920s. But it's a triumph. It's triumphalist. It's kind of strutting about. It's sort of preening. But there are still counterweights to it. I mean, Britain is still a counterweight, presumably. But also, it doesn't necessarily. I mean, the Kaiser's Germany at that point has achieved its aim. It has, it has shored itself up against Tsarist Russia. It has put France very firmly in its box. Presumably, the Kaiser now has his place in the sun that he's always wanted. But I'm guessing the Kaiser's Germany doesn't have many more complicated war aims in the 1920s. Hitler's Germany, by contrast, is so unstable, is based on constant conflict and constant on chaos. And so I don't see a Nazi new order. That world of the kind of the man in the high castle, the Amazon drama where Nazi rule continues for decades. I don't really see that happening because I just think that sort of furious, I used the word hysterical before, that almost hysterical dynamism at the heart of the Nazi project would unravel.
I'm not sure.
Eventually.
Because I think that at the heart of Nazi ideology is the idea that the strong have the right to, I mean, not only the right, but they have a kind of moral responsibility to crush the weak. I mean, the Nazis do what they do not because they want to be evil, but because they think they're doing what's right for their race. And if they've won a kind of victory, then that legitimates that perspective. And it only has to last for, say, a generation or two. And that then becomes part of the fabric of the way that people...
But Tom, you think people would copy them? You think people would... You think Nazism
yes.
would become ingrained in the way that I know you think? Because Tom, I mean, I'm not going to make Tom's a great argument for him, but Tom, one of Tom's great themes is how even if we're not, consciously Christians, everything we do is sort of permeated with kind of, as it were, Christian ideology. But you think that would have happened with Nazi ideology after one generation?
I think that part of the reason why the Nazis in the contemporary West serve as the embodiment of evil is that they did kind of target some of the key kind of ideological foundation stones of Christian Europe, of which obviously one is the idea that the strong owe a duty of care to the weak. The Nazis repudiated that. And the other is the idea that all human beings have an inherent dignity and that there is no Jew or Greek. And again, the Nazis repudiated that. The fact that they were defeated kind of has demonstrated, even if it's subliminally, the fact that those ideas are not just morally wrong, but are kind of, they're unsustainable, that you can't organize a society on that basis. And that, I think, is very important to the way that the West understands not just its politics, but the very essence of human nature. But had the Nazis won, had they kind of enshrined that as, their own victory, as evidence that what they were saying was right, that their race, the Nordic race, was superior to other races, and that strength was more important than weakness, and that the powerful did have a responsibility to crush the powerless, and they could point to a prostrated Europe as evidence for this, and they were not overthrown, they were not humiliatingly defeated, they were not crushed, they were not obliged to surrender unconditionally, then those ideas would have had a currency in a way that they haven't as a result of what actually happened. A world in which fascism was not conclusively defeated would be one in which it continued to thrive, because it does play with the way that lots of people do instinctively think. People are instinctively chauvinist. People are instinctively inclined to think that the strong are more important and better than the weak. And it's only kind of centuries and centuries of Christian conditioning, really, in the context of Europe, that has changed that view. And if those values had been seen to be defeated, then I think that the corollary of that would reverberate through the decades.
So this is going to be a strange transition. So I'm going to try to transition it this way. One could make, certainly with the First World War Germans, one could make a case that there's a colonialism aspect involved, right? The place in the sun question is much more open. But even in the Second World War, strategic war aims of Germany, that's a colonialism too, in a sense, right? We're gonna take over the Slavic lands, and we're going to rule over the Slavs, and they're going to be the slaves for the Nazi state. We had talked earlier about colonialism, and I'm curious about, in the United States, we have certain figures in history. One is Tecumseh, for example, who tried to unite the native tribes against the United States at a certain point to try to figure out how you could fight back against the colonial powers and the colonial movements. I find that if you go into the history of, say, sub-Saharan Africa, North America, Central Asia, South Asia, you have all these attempts to try to fight back against the divide and conquer strategy that's so important in the colonial approach. I wanted to ask you guys, if you had an opinion, which region would you consider the greatest odds-on favorite to resist colonial subjugation if they were ever able to unite in a Tecumseh-like way against the colonial powers?
So any region of the world that ended up being absorbed into a European,
as part of the divide and conquer sort of strategy, yes.
No question, India. the British conquest of India was a kind of Anglo-Indian conquest. I mean, it wouldn't have been possible for the British to,
because the numbers
the
were
East
so
India
small.
Company.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a private company taking over the whole subcontinent. I mean, there's no way that they could possibly have done that unless India was completely fragmented and there were substantial segments of Indian society and different states within the framework of the whole subcontinent willing to work with the British, and in a way to use the British just as the British were using them. So the Raj was it was a kind of Anglo-Indian condominium. But I think that it was entirely possible in the 18th century for, say in South India, the Sultanate of Hyderabad, of Mysore, Tipu Sultan in Mysore was, he a heroic fighter against the British. Had Hyderabad, had Mysore, perhaps had they allied with the Marathas, there's no way the British could have conquered India. So I would, and the moment that the sense of a united India came to be formed in the late 19th and 20th century, it became obvious to everyone that the Raj was going to end. I mean, even the most kind of dyed-in-the-wool imperialist had to accept the moment that there was a kind of Indian national consciousness emerging, there was no way that the British could hold on to India because the mismatch was too great.
I agree with Tom,
But
and I think that the reason India works, Tom, is because there had been empires in India, so it's perfectly plausible to imagine that in the 18th, had history worked out differently, that there would have been some dominant empire in India that would easily have been able to see off the East India Company. Do you not think? I mean, but that's not the case
completely.
with other parts of the world. So that thing of all the colonial, I would say almost every single European colonial empire works because it works with local collaborators and local allies. And that starts right at the beginning when the Spaniards arrive in the Valley of Mexico, and then later on when they arrive in what's now Peru. So in both cases, the traditional view that we have is completely wrong. So the idea a tiny band of Spaniards pitch up and through their amazing technology and the fact that everybody thinks they're gods, they're able to overcome colossally superior numbers. I mean, that's just obviously nonsense. What happens is that in both cases, they're working with lots of local allies because the societies in which they've arrived are deeply fragmented and would always have been fragmented. So, the what we think of as the Aztecs, they have lots of local rivals. I think Tlaxcala are the most obvious ones that the Spaniards ally with, and the Spaniards are only able to defeat them because of their local allies. Same thing with the Incas. The Spaniards arrived, the Incas are divided, but they were probably always going to be divided because they had a history of division, and there were lots of people who resented the Incas. So that's slightly different from India, because I think in India hadn't you, Tom, kind of big, powerful, rich, united civilizations that could easily have seen off European intruders. And I don't think that's true in the Americas. It's impossible to imagine, I think, the Native Americans of North America forming this massive confederation that would have seen off the French and the British. I mean, they had no history of such alliances.
No, but here's what's funny. They imitated exactly what you were talking about, right? They did it in reverse. So someone like Tecumseh, for example, tried to use the British to help him defeat the Americans in the same way that before there was a United States, certain tribes allied with the French or the British to try to see the other side. In other words, that's almost the reverse of what you're talking about, right?
But by that point, it's too late, isn't it?
It is too late.
But also, but also, I mean, I think technology does matter, and scale of size matters as well. But to go back to the technology, I mean, Dan, you were saying, why were people, I don't know, beyond the frontiers of the Roman Empire not able to replicate the legions? Because they didn't have the society, the culture that had generated the legions. And likewise, if you're going through a kind of an industrial quantum leap, if you're going through the Industrial Revolution, if you are developing weapons that are fearsome and devastating on a scale beyond the imaginings of people who don't have factories, who don't have steel mills, and if you are a civilization that is able to feed vast numbers of people and generate a huge population growth, then there's no way you can resist it. And that essentially, going right the way back through the entire span of time, that's why we all now have urban civilizations and we're not hunter-gatherers, is because ultimately there are societal advances that will make certain societies stronger, more powerful, more devastating, more lethal than others. And when there is a total mismatch, those who are the weaker there's no way that they can withstand. So I would say that I'm sure that the Aztecs could have seen off the Spaniards, but I don't think that there was ever any prospect that the Native Americans of the Great Plains could have seen off the United States. I don't think that there was ever any prospect of the native people in Australia seeing off the settlers in the 19th and 20th century. There was just no way it would ever have been possible.
Okay, so I'll make this the last question, but it's certainly a trapdoor kind of question because it may. So one of the things you get here in the United States, and I think you get them all over the world, is this idea of that these technologically superior or I don't know what you would call it, logistically, infrastructurally superior entities should not have done what they did. Right? So for example, the people who came from Europe should not have done what they did in a broad sense. We're not talking about individual